Hola, somos Alberto Vallejo y Beatriz Ortega Botas y pues hemos organizado este ciclo de charlas aquí en Foro este año que se llaman Opacidad, Prevalente, Elocuencia y Reanudación de Legados formales de Baja Legibilidad. Y antes de empezar queríamos dar las gracias a todo el equipo de la feria, sobre todo a Maribel Arias, la directora, por habernos invitado, y a Ana Álvarez, que ahí está, por habernos ayudado tanto durante todas estas semanas a organizarlo, y a todos los invitados que han aceptado nuestra invitación, a Cédric, Fauq, a Harry Burke, a Lidia Uramane, a Deborah Joyce Holman, Ebony Haynes y Pujan Karambelli.
Sí.
No sé si...
Y nada, bueno, os contamos un poco este año, cuando Maribel nos invitó a hacer las charlas, nos dijo que pensásemos un poco en cómo el arte contemporáneo, que iba a pasar un poco en los próximos años, y nos parecía como que había algo que tenía que ver con cuestionar un poco la legibilidad y la transparencia desde posiciones situadas, y como ciertas estrategias estéticas y formales que utilizaban lenguajes complejos, que en algunos casos tenían como paralelismos con ciertas estrategias estéticas del siglo XX, como el minimal, el conceptual, el ready-made, el recorte. Y nos apetecía mucho hablar de esto y hemos invitado a una serie de agentes que recientemente han trabajado un poco desde distintos puntos, ¿no? Bien sea como la escritura, la curaduría o el arte, como este tipo de obras que nos parece que tiene que ver con esto y que nos van a servir un poco como para debatir todas estas cuestiones.
Genial. Y a un nivel un poco más práctico, las charlas van a durar 30 minutos más o menos y habrá una pausa de comida de 3 a 4, creo. Y luego seguiremos con el segundo bloque, que serán otras 3 charlas. Y yo creo que ya pues vamos a comenzar. Con esto ya os vamos a dejar con la primera charla de Cédric Fauq, que Cédric es comisario y escritor. Ha sido comisario del Palais de Tokio en París. Y recientemente también ha sido nombrado comisario jefe en el CAPCE, que es el Museo de Arte Contemporáneo de Burdeos. So, Cédric, whenever you are ready, you can...
Thank you so much
for being here.
Te dejo aquí.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yeah. So the presentation I'm gonna give is titled Conceptual Undoings, Ravings about Black Monochromes and Other Dark Matters. Oh, actually it's not the PDF I had sent. Well, it's okay. If it's in... Yeah. Okay. What I'm going to try to do is to kind of speak about what I'm trying to do as a curator through the prism of 3 artists' practices. But I'm going to first give a bit of background about what I'm trying to do in relation to the invitation to speak first amongst that great group of people. And I want to reiterate the fact that I'm quite humbled and very happy to be here. So thank you again for the invitation and for making everything as simple as possible. And there will be like a bit of a kind of leap backwards in history, which some of you might have heard of in terms of the discovery of a monochrome. Well, it's been a big deal in France, but maybe people who are not really aware of what's happening there. So it might be a bit of a surprise, maybe a bit even of a shock for some people. I'll have a look at your faces once I start to speak about it. So yeah, just to say that I'm speaking from the point of view of a curator here, in a quite classical sense of the term, as someone working with exhibitions, and who is meant to kind of work with artists to make their practices visible and legible, which often revolve around the use of discourse and narration, but also in terms of spatialization in an exhibition context. And here there is obviously like a first kind of paradox in relation to what Yaby is trying to deal with in the discussion of eligibility. But there is definitely like there is definitely like a logic behind all this, because since I've started to work with exhibitions and specifically around the idea of blackness and the concept of blackness, I've been trying to work against this idea of making things legible and visible. And so I'm interested mostly in, when dealing with blackness, interested in practices that make blackness illegible and that go against representation. What is the interest in doing that, you might ask? For me, it was very much related to the fact that I noticed through like several research, historical research mostly, that there is a lot of violence that is attached to the representation of black bodies, black subjects, and black people when taking place in an exhibition context. And so the kind of historical anchor that I've been mostly focusing on were human zoos and cabinets of curiosities as those kind of, that kind of point in time where black bodies and other types of bodies, exoticized bodies, were being exhibited, and how today I think the way things are still dealt with, that violence is still very much present. And so so I've been interested very much in practices that create misunderstandings, misspellings, misrepresentations, and what I'm trying to do, what I like to kind of create as reactions with exhibitions when they're dealing with those subjects, is making people ask themselves, but is it black? Is it from a black artist? Is it about blackness? And the main question is then, for me, how to provoke that misunderstanding in the first place and go against my kind of role as a curator who is meant to make things legible and visible. And I've been mostly focusing on black performance through the likes of Lyria Lewis, Paul Maeke, but also Beyoncé and Grace Jones, for instance. And as well, conceptualism, and what I started to call like updated conceptualism last year through a text that I published in Musée, through the practices of Ima Abassi Okon, Cameron Rowland, Caroline Lazard, Abbas Zaidi, Rhea Dillon, Olu Ogunaike, Kudelis Brazelton, and many more. So I'll speak about 3 of those artists later on, and specific works. But first I wanted to start with something you can see here, which is like an image of an exhibition that is currently taking place in Paris. It's not like a show that you can really visit. You have to contact the gallerist, who is called Johan Naldi. We discovered 2 years ago, or rediscovered 2 years ago, a set of 17 works that belonged to a show which took place in 1882 in Paris, organized by a movement that we now call les arts incohérents, the incoherent arts. It was a group of people that was led by a guy called Jules Ferry at the time, and the very idea was to kind of make jokes through arts in a very simple way. And those works we knew about through like list of works and through like reviews, but there were we never had like a chance to kind of see them. There was no physical trace anywhere to be found. And 2 years ago, magically, lots of them, 17 of them, kind of emerged in the world. And one of them specifically, this one, is a black monochrome. So now in the kind of, I was saying that it's kind of a big discovery, because it's obviously like taking place in the late 19th century. It's considered as the first monochrome, or like at least monochrome in the context of the arts. And the title is maybe the thing that is the most kind of surprising, and to me the thing that is the most interesting thing. It's called Combat de Nègres pendant la nuit, which you could translate by Blacks Fighting in the Night. It was made by an artist called Paul Billot, who is a white artist. And we knew about the monochrome through someone who had kind of reproduced the work in the same year in a book, someone called Alphonse Allais. And he was just represented by like a black square, basically, in that book. But the title was a bit different because it was called Combat de Nègres dans une cave pendant la nuit. So blacks fighting in the night in a cave. So obviously for me I was a bit like, what? What is this? First black monochrome, and the title is referring directly to this, to the idea of black bodies. And I was actually like making myself the reflection earlier today. First I was thinking that it was two, but actually it can be more. There is no kind of there is nothing in the title that says that it's two black bodies. It could be more. Combat de Nègres dans une cave pendant la nuit. And obviously what's interesting here is the fact that there is no representation of those bodies. Putting it back in the kind of historical context, this is meant to be taken as a joke, but no one is laughing today. But the title and the kind of like concealing of the scene of the image is more than the joke itself, is what is interesting to me in relation to the strategies that some artists are using today to deal with race and blackness. And so I'm asking myself, how do we read? That's not for me. How do we read this monochrome today? And I'm using the term read rather than seeing, because the title is obviously what gives the key to unlock the piece. And the joke itself is about not being able to see at the end, through the superposition of darkness, through the night, the dark skin, and the cave, with the second title. So to me there is an interesting conundrum here between the concealing of a scene and the title. There is like a gap, opening a gap that enables for race as a concept to be undone, since it's not applied to a body per se, but a surface, a texture, a color. This first monochrome, this first joke, by not representing the black bodies fighting, could help understand how monochromes can make race as a concept whose making needs to be acknowledged to be unmade. I don't know if it's clear. I can go back to it a bit later, and I think it might kind of come across a bit clearer as I go along. But yeah, I just wanted to take this as a first step to speak about the artist and the works that I'm going to talk about just now. 3 artists that try to understand how can monochromes and other dark matters can help us in foregrounding the work of conceptual undoing, as I called it, when it comes to race. So basically there is, for me, this whole idea of race as being like a concept that has been built, and how today there is like both the necessity to acknowledge how this making of the concept happened, to be able to like address the social issues that we're facing today, and specifically inequality and violence in relation to race, but also how to undo this specific concept today. And what I think is happening is that some artists can help us do this. And the 3 artists I'm going to focus on are Kudelis Brazelton, Olu Ogunaike, and Ima Abassi-Okon. And well, there is no title here of the that I'm at the third part of my intervention here, and I called it Technologies of Opacity. And we're gonna go through like those works. Yeah, that's what we have. a bit of a sneak peek. And we start with Coudelis Brazelton, who is very much thinking about the relationship between adornment and blackness. And here this first work, Undergeared, is kind of coming across as a lunar skin, you could say. And I wanted to first start with this one because it kind of shed a light, I would say, in relation to the monochrome that we had before. So here the night comes back and the skins become a satellite. And it's like as if you were basically like zooming from this work on this work to kind of see the cracks and the texture of the paint. And I actually had the opportunity to see the work in the flesh. And it was kind of incredible, the textures. It's very rich, actually. And so I was kind of imagining that this work would be a close-up of that painting, while at the same time being a close-up of a skin. And actually it's like several skins put that collaged together. Here's a second work by Coudelis Brazelton called Black Dollars. And I'm going to read like a text that enables to kind of understand the making of the piece. 102,000 pieces of construction paper are cut into the dimension similar to US currency. Painted over with iodine, wrapped in rubber bands before the plastic sealing. Bands are stacked onto an anthracite-coated wooden pallet to prepare for transit. All of these steps blend a personalized sense of assemblage with the assembly line style of the cut, all for a formal reference to a scam. Black Dollar acts as a modulated sculpture that shifts composition based on whose hands are scanning the packages. And here I'm mostly interested in how the paint basically is used as a way to enhance the concealing of the US dollars and kind of trying to suspend authenticity, I would say. Asking what's fake, who is meant to be fooled as well, and I think that's very much palpable when and understandable when he says that Black Dollar, this work, acts as a modulated sculpture that shifts composition based on whose hands are scanning the packages, basically. And this idea of authenticity for me is like very much interesting in relation to blackness, obviously, and trying to go against, quite often this idea of blackness when dealt within exhibition context and contemporary art, there is like kind of, we often find this idea of black culture and trying to make it as kind of authentic as possible, as true as possible, which is like very problematic to me. And so all of those gestures that are going against this, for me, are quite interesting to actually undo this very concept of race as something that is like also fake, basically. Then we move to Olu Ogunaike, who is an artist I've been working with for a few years now, who some of you in the room know very well. Who is an artist who is working around ideas of hospitality, labor, and hostility as well, through the prism of blackness, but really trying to encode those very ideas, or at least this idea of and concept of blackness through the work. So it's not something that you can really see or feel at first sight. Here, what you have is like a shot of an installation view of one of his latest exhibitions happening at Cell Project Space in London. And basically this show was made out of woodcuts of London plane trees to create that kind of flooring which you can see here. And the idea was for people to unmake the floor, to unveil what comes across as here a black monochrome, basically. And for me, I mean, there's a lot around the origin and the history around the tree that has been used to make the flooring, but it's not what I'm interested in here. I'm more interested in actually the concealing of the charcoal monochrome, because it's charcoal that is used to make the image, and the kind of labor that is asking for that monochrome to be uncovered. Knowing that it had to be, you had to do that with like a tool that he also made himself, a crowbar that he made himself, and obviously here this idea that basically you are walking on a monochrome without knowing it, and on dark matters is for me something that was kind of very telling in relation to a history of oppression and a history of invisibilization of certain bodies and of certain histories, and the idea of basically to be able to see what is happening, this idea that you need to basically do the work, take part in the labor of uncovering the monochrome, basically. And this other work here is his most recent one. So there is the doors, which are made out of, that he made himself through a technique that he developed to be able to reproduce OSB sheets. So they are like those kind of woodcuts that are made together and glued together, so they can then create a surface. And that's something that he developed a few years ago. And the whole idea was how to reproduce like an industrial process manually in the first place. And there was also this idea of using something that is considered waste and leftovers to reuse them as sculptures. And also this idea of origin of the wood is also like, again, very interesting to him. And how the different origins of the wood could be related to different origins of people as well. And this idea of bringing them together and making them glue as like an idea of togetherness, basically. And here it's like at a level and scale that is never, I mean, I'm quite surprised actually at how he was able to make this happen. And it's the first time it's also like hinged onto something that can move, like a door. Usually it's like used as surfaces, whether they are tables or walls, and they often play with like this idea of concealing again. But yeah, here it's like also this idea of basically what, kind of embracing the architecture of a space that he is currently living, because it's the last, it was that basically the graduate show of the Royal Academy in London. And so this idea of like entering a space and leaving a space is made, manifest through that gesture, I would say. But again, like speaking about this idea of togetherness and the glue between us through those OSB sheets. I think it's also like something that I wanted to kind of show, because it's kind of very close to those works here by Ima Abassi Okon. They are also OSB sheets. But here what interests the artist, Ima Abassi Okon, who is like, I would say, to make it very short, working on moments of pauses and slowness, sound being a very important aspect of a practice, but here we do not have it. And that series of works, they have very long titles, but there is always a name that comes back, which is the name of a gospel singer called Mahalia Jackson. And she's using those boards in very different ways, and there are lots of different like layers to them. But there is again this idea of waste and leftovers being upgraded, you could say, through like the varnishing process. And then the framing itself is like quite important because she's using what she calls exotic woods to frame those works. And she speaks about those works as conjuring of hope, manifestations of hope, which I find quite beautiful, but something that I'm still trying to myself understand. But the aspect that I'm quite interested in here is the fact that they're used quite obviously here as monochromes, but they've been also used as supports and plinth for other works, and they're also used now more and more often as boards for other things to be stacked on and displayed on. So the work becomes the support for other works and even walls for other works, which I think is quite interesting in this idea of the interplay between the foreground, the background, and the underground, and maybe the gesture that Olu was also enacting through the monochrome that was beneath the ground, the flooring, and maybe here the monochrome refuses its own status as a monochrome, I would say. It's an interesting kind of interplay between the fact that it both wants to be kind of valued, and I think this is what the whole kind of vanishing process wants to do, and at the same time go against this idea, the idea of fetishization or the fixation of the work as that kind of precious thing, basically. And so those are the three practices and I wanted to focus on, and those different strategies I wanted to focus on. And I don't know if the questions happen now or if they happen later. But that's what I wanted to introduce to you today. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. If there are any.
Should we have like a few questions now if people have some questions?
Yeah.
When I look at both of you all together.
Tenemos un micro de mano por si hay alguna pregunta.
I didn't speak too long. That's fine. Should I just move? I mean, because...
Sorry?
Should I just leave?
No, you can stay. Hola, si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, podemos hacer un poquito de preguntas ahora. If anybody has any questions.
Ooh.
I wanted to ask about reading and literature and text, because you started with this really provocative title, which of course creates an image, and then it's obscured and becomes, as you said, the monochrome is used to create invisibility. And there's a famous series of works from Glenn Ligon where he's quoting Zora Neale Hurston and saying, blackness against whiteness is this extraordinarily strong contrast, that the black body is seen strongest in that way. Can you talk about these artists in relation to these ideas of
Glenn Ligon?
In this juxtaposition between this kind of literary discussion of like, let's say, The Invisible Man or Zora Neale Hurston's saying the black body is most contrasted in a white space, such as the white cube. Okay, thank you.
I mean, there's obviously to me it's quite interesting that the artists I'm focusing on are like mostly quite emerging artists that are, to me, revising a certain idea of conceptual practices. Obviously, it has a history, and it can be inscribed into a legacy of Glenn Ligon Adrian Piper is obviously someone that is also like in the back of my mind all the time, and in the back of those artists' practices all the time. I think one of the things that I've been trying to deal with is this idea of how to make yourself present in those spaces and how to make such practices present in those spaces while kind of escaping them at the same time. And it's something that I've been, well, this idea of fugitivity and this idea of refusal are words and concepts that we've been very much using a lot in relation to black artists and black theory, I would say. But I feel like Glenn Lagan to me is not someone who is like very much trying to escape, or at least because of the. I mean, it just belongs to another moment when there was no artists of color yet in museums, in exhibitions, or the way they were present was very much kind of not complexified at all. So yeah, for me at the moment it's like I know it's there, but to me it's like other strategies that were used. Although like David Hammond's, for instance, I mean, like, you know, this idea of refusal is very much present in his own relation to the art world, and some of his actions. I mean, Sengan Ngudi as well. Not expecting only to be platformed by institutions. I think so. But the contrasts the fact that the contrasts. I mean, at some point I started to make peace, I think, with the institution and this idea of the white space. Just actually thinking that this idea of the contrast could be helpful to make things actually legible. But maybe it's not legible to everyone. Maybe it's not legible to like a lot of people. And one example that I often use is a show that I did. Well, that was taking a halftime show for the Super Bowl that Beyoncé performed in, but it was not her halftime show. It was the halftime show of Coldplay, and where she nearly fell at some point. And I was using that very moment as an example of black performance put into like fail, basically, for that show that I did, which was all around this idea of blackness and staging blackness and the failure that is like inherent to like the staging of blackness, basically. And so that show didn't have any kind of black skin visible, and a lot of people were very confused. A lot of white people were very confused. But at that, and people who kind of understood or felt what the show was trying to do or say were people of color, basically. I mean, I did not do the show having that in the back of my mind, but that's just what I noticed after it happened, and I got feedback, basically. So it's kind of those things that I'm trying to do, I would say. I don't know if that went much further than your initial question. Other questions?
Questions?
Ooh.
Thank you, Cédric, for the presentation. I just very simply curious if you can say more about why. I mean, it was a very shocking monochrome that you introduced your presentation with, and then you went on to speak about these practices that you characterize as a kind of updated conceptualism. And I'm just curious if you can explain a little bit more why you were interested to move from this kind of monochrome, which is like a very modernist, painterly gesture, to this lineage of conceptualism, which is kind of, in some ways, departing from this critique of representation itself and looking for other forms of of enunciation and provocation.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious to hear you kind of, talk a bit more about that.
Basically, I think what I'm interested in the work that monochrome. No, it's not possible anymore. What I'm interested in the monochrome was, it was kind of fascinating to me that at the time when the whole idea of race was made and like kind of upheld and validated, that this happened to me was kind of it's kind of a glitch, I think, in the whole history of how white people represented black people, basically. So I saw it. For me, it's also interesting that it's a joke because obviously the whole history of black representation by white people is also very much related to like how to make fun of black people. And here, I don't know. I don't think the work itself is like trying to make fun of white people. And you have actually like maybe something that can be helpful to understand a bit better. Is to go back to all of the different monochromes that were made. And in the first image that there was, you could see another one on the right. That was a green one, and it's basically always trying to, in the title, use or put a lot of different things that are the same color, basically, to kind of give a visual representation, which is just a monochrome, basically. So, although the title itself can be questionable for sure, and I was trying to understand about the tradition of like this idea of combat de nègre. It's something that actually comes back in history and in another title of a theater play that I've been like also using a lot when dealing with this show about Beyoncé. Actually, a play by Bernard-Marie Coltès called Combat de Nègre de Chien. So just the fact that this very title was coming back as well related to that painting was to me like also very powerful, I would say. And I'm still trying to understand, I think, how to manipulate it or how to approach it. There is a lot of like mystery around it, for sure. So that was just an attempt, I would say, to try to maybe give like also like a history to and a legacy to like the strategies that some artists are like using today, although they were not made by enacted by artists of color. For me, it's just interesting that at that time there was already like something like that could happen. Although the direction and the aim and who he was speaking to was totally different. I think in the way we look at it today, it can still like say a lot. So I don't know if the relation is like a logical one. But yeah, I had to show it. I could not show it, I think. But yeah, the discussion. It's a trigger for discussions, for sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.